The log was already open when Dr. Severin Kalos arrived at the research station, the cursor blinking at the end of a sentence that his predecessor had never finished. VTH Deep Field Observatory, Research Log. Subject Sector 77 Null, Forbidden Designation, Human Origin. Principal Investigator, Dr. Cale Toran, Senior Xenophysicist, Veth Conclave. Entry 1442, Final. The radiation pattern in the inner shell has shifted again. The new configuration does not match any known stellar arrangement. It matches the neural topology of A. The entry ended there. No sign-off, no archival stamp, no formal closing sequence of the kind that the Conclave's Bureau of Deep Field Research required at the termination of every log session, no matter how routine. Toran's credentials were still authenticated in the system, his session technically active after 9 months of silence, the observatory's network treating his absence as an unusually long pause between keystrokes. Kalos read the incomplete sentence 3 times, standing in the blue glow of the console with his travel case still sealed on the deck behind him, and then he turned to the viewport and looked at the space his predecessor had spent 11 years studying. He saw nothing, that was the point. Sector 77, Null, occupied a volume of space roughly 400 light-years across on the Conclave's navigational charts. It appeared as a gray absence, not black, which would indicate confirmed void, but gray, which indicated that the Conclave's cartographic authority had declined to assign it a status at all. The gray had been there for 6 centuries. Every species that participated in the Veth Conclave's shared navigational framework had agreed, through a process that no official record described as a vote, to leave the sector uncharted. The agreement predated the Conclave itself. It predated most of the species that honored it. It was one of the oldest continuous acts of deliberate ignorance in galactic history, and it concerned a region of space that had once been home to a species called humans. The humans were not discussed. They were not studied in any sanctioned curriculum. They were not remembered in any official capacity. 6 centuries ago, something had happened in the space they occupied, something the Conclave's historical archives referred to only as the transition, and afterward, the space was forbidden, not contested, not quarantined, not embargoed pending further investigation. Forbidden in the old sense of the word, set apart, declared outside the jurisdiction of inquiry, placed beyond the boundary of what the Conclave's institutions were willing to know. The gray on the chart was not a gap waiting to be filled. It was a scar, healed over with 600 years of policy and covered by the institutional equivalent of scar tissue. Budgets, committees, rotation protocols, safety margins measured in light years, and the quiet, persistent understanding that the post at the edge of the gray was where the Conclave sent scientists it had run out of other uses for. Kalos was not one of those scientists. He had requested this assignment, and the request had surprised everyone who knew him, which was a considerable number of people across the Conclave's academic institutions. He was a Keithrani, a tall, angular species with skin the color of wet slate, and 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal line across a face that other species often found difficult to read. The Keithrani processed visual information in layers. The outer 2 eyes handled motion and peripheral awareness, mapping the shape of a room or the trajectory of a moving object with continuous passive attention, while the inner 2 focused on fine detail with a resolution that surpassed most optical instruments. This layered perception made the Keithrani natural scientists, natural analysts, natural classifiers of phenomena that other species experienced as overwhelming noise. Where a Pelinari saw chaos, a Keithrani saw structure. Where a Veilshi saw undifferentiated data, a Keithrani saw taxonomy waiting to be articulated. Kalos had spent 31 years in the discipline of xenoradiation physics, the study of electromagnetic signatures left behind by extinct or departed civilizations. He had cataloged the decay patterns of 14 dead worlds. He had published the definitive taxonomy of post-civilizational radiation types, a 9-volume work that the Conclave's academic institutions referenced as the standard text, and that graduate students in 4 species universities were required to master before entering fieldwork. His name was not merely recognized in the field. His name was synonymous with it. There was no xenoradiation physics before Kalos in the same way there was no periodic table before the chemist who first arranged the elements. The discipline existed as raw observation, and he had given it its architecture. He was, by any measure the Conclave recognized, the most qualified xenophysicist alive. He had requested this assignment because Sector 77 null represented the only radiation source in the known galaxy that did not fit his taxonomy. Every other anomaly had eventually yielded to his categories. Every other dead world had revealed its signature, surrendered its pattern, and taken its place in the orderly structure that explained it completely. This one had not. He intended to make it fit. The observatory was a Conclave research installation, one of 3 that ringed Sector 77 null at a distance the Conclave's safety protocols deemed adequate. The distance was 12 light-years, a gap so enormous that the observatory's instruments required 7-hour integration cycles to resolve even basic spectral data from the sector's outer boundary. Kalos had reviewed the specifications before his arrival and found them absurd. 12 light-years was not a safety margin. It was a statement of institutional anxiety dressed in the language of protocol. No natural phenomenon required that much distance for safe observation. No radiation source, no matter how energetic, posed a measurable threat at 12 light-years to an installation shielded to Conclave military specifications. The Conclave was not studying the sector from 12 light-years away because it was dangerous. It was studying it from 12 light-years away because it was afraid. Kalos was not afraid, he was certain. Certainty was the architecture of his entire career, the precise, methodical confidence that came from 31 years of measuring things that had already happened, cataloging the remnants of civilizations that were already gone, and fitting each remnant into a framework that explained it completely. The dead left patterns. The patterns had rules. The rules could be learned, applied, tested, and taught to others who would apply them in turn. This was the foundation of xenophysics, and Kalos had built his professional life on it the way a structural engineer builds on bedrock. Not because bedrock is inspiring, but because it does not move. Sector 77, null, was simply the next measurement. The radiation was anomalous, which meant his taxonomy was incomplete, which meant the taxonomy needed expanding, which was precisely the kind of work that had defined his career since his first published paper at the age of 23. He would observe, record, classify, and publish. The sector would acquire a designation. The gray on the chart would become a color, and the 6 centuries of deliberate ignorance would end, not with revelation or horror or existential confrontation, but with the quiet administrative satisfaction of a file properly closed. He unpacked his instruments on his first day. He initialized the sensor arrays, calibrated the primary detector against 3 reference stars, verified the communication link to the Conclave relay 14 light-hours distant, and opened a fresh research log under his own credentials. He began. Log entry day 3. Investigator, Dr. Severin Kalos Keith-Ronnie, Senior Xenophysicist. Subject, Preliminary Radiation Characterization, Sector 77, Null Outer Boundary. The baseline readings are unremarkable. The sector's outer shell emits a diffuse electromagnetic signature across a broad spectrum, with peak intensity in the low-frequency radio bands. The pattern is consistent with what my taxonomy classifies as Type 2 residual, post-civilizational background radiation, produced by the slow decay of abandoned technological infrastructure. I have seen identical profiles on Varith 4, on the Solen remnant, on the 6 worlds of the Pelin extinction, and on the 2 moons of the Hakathi silence. The match falls within 3 standard deviations on every metric I apply. There is nothing here that a competent graduate student could not categorize in an afternoon. I will begin deep spectrum analysis tomorrow. The integration cycles at this distance are inconvenient but manageable, 7 hours per exposure, yielding data at a resolution sufficient for spectral decomposition down to the 4th harmonic. I expect full classification within 60 days. I note for the record that the observatory's previous occupant, Dr. Kale Toron, did not file a single classification proposal during his 11-year tenure. I attribute this to the well-documented psychological effects of prolonged isolation at remote posts, which the conclave's occupational health literature describes as perceptual drift, a gradual loosening of analytical rigor in the absence of peer review and institutional structure. I am not concerned. I am Keith Ronnie. My perceptual architecture is designed for precisely this kind of sustained, isolated analytical focus. Drift is a problem for species whose cognition requires external scaffolding. Mine requires only the data and the discipline to read it correctly. Log entry day 9. Subject, deep spectrum anomaly first detection. The deep spectrum returns have introduced an irregularity. Beneath the Type 2 residual layer, beneath the expected noise of decaying infrastructure, there is a secondary emission source operating at significantly lower power, but with a degree of coherence that Type 2 radiation does not exhibit. Type 2 emissions are stochastic, random energy release following a well-understood half-life curve, the electromagnetic equivalent of a fire burning down to ash. This secondary source is not stochastic. Its emission pattern carries a temporal regularity that implies a sustained, organized process, generating the output. I have provisionally designated this as a Type 2 variant, a subcategory for cases where residual infrastructure maintains a degree of coordinated output, typically due to automated maintenance systems that outlast their operators. Such systems are uncommon but well documented in the literature. The Pelin extinction's 7th world maintained a synchronized orbital defense grid for 400 years after the last Pelin individual expired. The coherence may also be an artifact of the integration cycle. 7-hour exposures at this distance could introduce harmonic patterns through crosstalk in the signal chain. I am recalibrating the primary array to rule out instrumental contamination. This is a measurement problem. I will solve it by measuring more carefully. Log entry day 17. Subject, instrumental contamination ruled out. The recalibration is complete. I rebuilt the primary array's signal chain from the detector element to the processing core, replacing 2 amplifier stages, and rerouting the data path to eliminate 3 potential sources of harmonic interference. The process took 5 days and required tools I had not expected to need this early in the rotation. The coherent secondary emission is not an artifact. It persists across all detector configurations, all integration windows, and all pointing angles that I have tested. The signal is real, external, and originating from within the sector boundary. I have deepened the analysis. The secondary emission operates on a cycle of approximately 24.7 standard hours. It strengthens for roughly 16 hours, weakens for roughly 8, and repeats with a stability that approaches the mechanical variance less than 4 minutes over the 14 days of continuous monitoring I have now accumulated. I recognize the category. This is a circadian pattern of biological rhythm, the electromagnetic expression of a process synchronized to the rotation period of a planetary body. Something in Sector 77 null is keeping time, and the time it keeps corresponds to no planet in the conclave's current astronomical catalogs. Cross-referencing historical archives, The period of 24.7 hours falls within a marginal deviation of the standard rotation of a world that the conclave's oldest entries identify as Earth. I note this finding with professional interest but without alarm. Biological rhythms persist in post-civilizational environments for considerable periods. Automated systems programmed to biological schedules can continue operating centuries after their operators have gone. I will locate the mechanical source of the rhythm and classify it accordingly. Log entry day 26. Subject: mechanical source not found. I have spent 9 days searching for the infrastructure responsible for the circadian emission. I have mapped the outer boundary of Sector 77 null in 4 spectral bands, identified every discrete energy source within the first 8 light-years of the sector's interior, and cross-referenced each against the conclave's archive of known human technological signatures. There is no infrastructure, no orbital stations, no ground-based reactors, no communication arrays, power distribution grids, navigational beacons, or automated systems of any kind. Nothing that registers as a manufactured object at any wavelength I have examined. The energy sources I detected are stellar natural stars, burning normally without technological modification. The circadian emission does not originate from a machine. It originates from the sector itself, from the entire 400 light-year volume, radiating as a single unified source, as though the vacuum between the stars were breathing. I will admit this is unexpected. I will not admit it is unexplainable. There are deep space phenomena capable of producing coordinated emissions across large volumes, dark matter interactions, resonant magnetic field structures, quantum vacuum oscillations in regions of anomalously low matter density. The scale here is unprecedented but not theoretically impossible. I will formulate a hypothesis and design a test. The measurement continues. Log entry day 34. Subject: third signal layer detected. While constructing a dark matter interaction model for the circadian emission, I discovered a third layer in the radiation data. Beneath the type 2 residual, beneath the circadian rhythm, there is an additional signal extremely faint, far below the noise floor of standard instruments. I detected it only by pushing the integration cycle to its theoretical maximum of 19 hours, sacrificing all temporal resolution for raw sensitivity. The signal is structured, not periodic like the circadian rhythm. Structured, carrying information in a pattern too complex to be natural noise and too regular to be stochastic decay. There is an architecture to it, a grammar, a system of encoding that I spent 4 hours isolating and 4 more decoding. The signal uses a base-2 binary format, the same computational encoding that human technological systems employed, according to the conclave's archived technical specifications on pre-transition human infrastructure. The content is a sequence of numerical values that, when plotted spatially using standard 3-dimensional Cartesian mapping, produce a coordinate model. The model is of this observatory, my position relative to the sector boundary, the rotational orientation of my primary detector array, accurate to within 1/100th of a degree, the power output of my communication systems, the spectral profile of my own sensor emissions, including a calibration drift in the secondary amplifier that I had not yet noticed or corrected. The signal from Sector 77 null contains a precise, current, continuously updated representation of the facility that is observing it. I have verified the decoding against 6 independent algorithms and cross-referenced the coordinate model against the observatory's engineering specifications, which are filed in the conclave's public database. The match is exact, not within tolerance, exact. I note this finding and set it aside for systematic investigation. There are possible explanations that do not require attributing awareness to empty space reflected signals, echo artifacts, the observatory's own emissions interacting with the sector boundary and returning with encoded positional data imprinted by the geometry of the interaction. I will test these possibilities methodically. I am still certain this phenomenon has a classification within my existing framework. I have simply not located it yet. Log entry day 41. Subject: the adaptive mirror. The reflection hypothesis does not hold. I repositioned the primary array overnight, a 30-degree slew that significantly altered the observatory's electromagnetic profile. If the encoded signal were a passive reflection, the repositioning would propagate into the returned signal at light speed, arriving with the round-trip delay, and showing both old and new configurations superimposed during the transition period. The signal updated cleanly. Within the light travel delay window, the old model was replaced by the new model in a single coherent step, no overlap, no blending, no transitional noise. The sector did not reflect my change. It observed my change, processed it, reconstructed its internal model, and transmitted the updated representation back. The update captured all 17 actuator commands involved in the repositioning, including 2 automatic stabilization corrections generated by the array's software that I had not manually logged. The sector knows my instruments in greater detail than I do. I have not reported this finding to the central archive. I am aware this constitutes a deviation from reporting protocol, a deviation I would not have tolerated from any of my graduate students. I am also aware that reporting it as stated will trigger a review sequence designed to produce one outcome: the determination that no finding requiring institutional response has been made. The conclave's deep field review protocol is not a truth-seeking instrument. It is an institutional immune response, designed to identify foreign conclusions and encapsulate them before they can reach the conclave's decision-making organs. Toran spent 11 years here. His early log entries are clinical, precise, confident, the voice of a competent scientist performing competent work. They read like mine. His later entries are different, not panicked, not delusional, different as though the conceptual categories he used to organize his understanding had quietly shifted beneath him, and the words that once fit had stopped fitting, and the language of classification had revealed itself as a vessel too small for what it was being asked to contain. I am on day 41. I am still in the clinical phase, but I can see, for the first time, a point on the horizon where the clinical phase ends. Log entry day 52. Subject: Toran's private archive accessed. I found Toran's secondary files. They were stored in a partitioned section of the observatory's data core, encrypted with a key derived from the precise period of the sector's circadian rhythm, measured to 6 decimal places, a key that only someone who had independently discovered and characterized that rhythm to the same precision could derive. Toran hid his most important findings behind a lock that could only be opened by someone who had already made the discoveries the findings described. An elegant and merciless piece of archival design. The key is the knowledge, and the knowledge is only available to those who no longer need to be told. The archive contains 412 entries spanning 8 years. I will record the progression that matters. Years 1 through 3. Toran identifies the circadian rhythm, the encoded signal, and the adaptive mirroring behavior. His methods and conclusions mirror mine with a precision that I find both reassuring and troubling. He proposes 8 hypotheses and systematically eliminates each one through controlled testing. Year 4. Toran discovers that the encoded model extends beyond positional data. The signal includes a running representation of the observatory's internal systems, power distribution, life support parameters, atmospheric composition, thermal regulation profiles. He verifies this by making deliberate, documented changes to the station's internal environment and watching the sector's signal update to match within the light travel delay window. The sector is modeling not merely where the observatory is, but what is happening inside it. Year 5. Toran discovers the model includes him. The signal contains data points that correspond to his biometric signature: body temperature, cardiac rhythm, respiratory rate, neural electromagnetic output. The sector is tracking the physiological state of the person observing it with the same precision and fidelity that the person is using to observe the sector. The observer and the observed are measuring each other simultaneously, and the observed is producing the more accurate measurement. Year 6. Toran stops submitting reports to the central archive. His private entries multiply in frequency and detail, but lose their formal structure. He begins addressing the sector directly in his log, writing as though to a correspondent rather than to a file. I know you can model my heartbeat. Entry 1107 reads, I want to know if you can model what it means when it accelerates. Year 7. The entry that stopped my hands over the console for nearly an hour. Toran directed a narrowband signal into the sector, a simple carrier wave modulated with a standard conclave species identification code. The sector absorbed the signal without reflection or echo. 14 hours later, the sector returned a signal on the same frequency, at the same power, carrying the same identification format modified. Toran's species designation had been replaced with a string of values that, decoded using the conclave's own biochemical reference tables, produced a spectral analysis of xenophysics physiology. The sector had not responded to Toran. It had responded to whoever would come after him. It had looked through Toran's signal, past the species that sent it, and addressed its reply to the species that would eventually arrive to read it. To mind to me. Log entry day 58. Subject, sleep disruption, personal observation. I have been sleeping poorly. My rest cycles are fragmented. I wake at irregular intervals throughout the station's designated night period with the abruptness of someone shaken from deep sleep by a sound they cannot identify after the fact. This is not unusual for xenophysics assigned to isolated posts. Our species requires social calibration, the passive neurological process by which proximity to other xenophysics minds stabilizes individual cognitive architecture. The process operates below conscious awareness, a kind of ambient signal exchange between nearby xenophysics nervous systems that keeps each individual's perceptual framework aligned with the shared baseline of the species. In isolation, without that ambient correction, the architecture drifts. Minor perceptual distortions are documented consequences, a persistent sense of being observed, a feeling that one's thoughts are not entirely private, a gradual blurring of the boundary between the self and the surrounding environment. The conclave's occupational health guidelines recommend rotations no longer than 90 days for isolated xenophysics personnel. I am experiencing all of the documented symptoms. They are manageable. They are not the reason I am sleeping poorly. I am sleeping poorly because the circadian rhythm of Sector 77 null has begun to modulate the observatory's environmental systems. The effect is below the threshold of standard monitoring, a 0.2 degree variation in ambient temperature that rises during the sector's active phase and falls during its dormant phase, conducted through the station's hull from the sector boundary 12 light-years away, with a consistency that should not be physically possible at this distance. The station's climate control compensates automatically, but with a lag of several seconds, and my body xenophysics physiology being highly sensitive to thermal gradients, an adaptation from our homeworld's extreme continental temperature shifts, registers the fluctuation before the correction arrives. I wake at the transition points, every 24.7 hours, not on my own circadian schedule, on the sectors. I adjusted the climate control sensitivity by a factor of 12. The measurable fluctuation dropped below 0.01 degrees, far below any threshold of biological perception for any species in the conclave's medical databases. I verified this with 3 independent thermal monitors placed throughout my sleeping quarters. I still woke, same time, same transition point. I conducted a controlled isolation test. I sealed the viewport shutters. I disconnected the external sensor feeds. I powered down the primary detector array entirely. I shut off every instrument capable of receiving electromagnetic radiation from the sector's direction. I disabled the hull thermal sensors. I eliminated every physical pathway, electromagnetic, thermal, gravitational, acoustic, by which information about the sector's state could reach the observatory's interior. I still woke, at 3:47 station time. The exact transition point, verified afterward against the sector's emission record, which I had sealed in a time-locked archive before the test began. The information is not coming through the instruments. It is not coming through the hull. I have eliminated every physical channel, and the synchronization persists. The sector is not reaching me through the observatory. It is reaching me through me. I record this observation without speculation on the mechanism. Speculation would require a theoretical framework, and my theoretical framework does not contain a category for phenomena that bypass every known physical medium. The discipline of the log does not require speculation. It requires precision. I am precise. I am also, for the first time in 31 years of field work, uncertain whether precision is sufficient. Log entry day 71. Subject: the stars beyond the boundary. A supplementary observation that I wish to record before proceeding to the main finding of this rotation's critical phase. I have been conducting parallel spectral analyses of the stars visible within Sector 77 null, measuring their light through the observatory's optical array, and comparing the results against the conclave's stellar catalogs. The stars are real. Their hydrogen emission lines fall where they should. Their luminosity classes are correct. Their positions are consistent with standard galactic models. But there is an anomaly that I did not expect. The spectral noise floor, the random interference introduced by interstellar dust, magnetic turbulence, and the thousand small impurities that starlight accumulates as it travels through the interstellar medium, is declining. It has been declining steadily for the duration of my monitoring. The rate of decline, extrapolated from Toron's archived spectral data, suggests that the noise floor has dropped approximately 28% over the last 12 years. The stars beyond the boundary are getting cleaner. Their light is losing the interference that proves it has traveled through anything at all. The implication is that the interstellar medium within the sector, the dust, the particle winds, the magnetic eddies, the gravitational turbulence that make deep space a complex, heterogeneous environment, is being replaced. Not removed. Replaced by something uniform, something continuous, something that conducts light without altering it, the way a perfect vacuum would if a perfect vacuum could also be warm and aware and organized. I note this finding alongside the primary observations. It will become relevant shortly. Log entry day 79. Subject: the ocean. I have delayed this entry for 8 days. I will write it now because the discipline of the log requires it, and because discipline is the only structure I have left that I trust more than the evidence of my own instruments. I reconfigured the primary array for maximum resolution imaging of the sector's interior, pushing the instrument into an operating mode the manufacturer describes as not recommended for sustained use, exceeds thermal tolerances on the tertiary amplification stage. The integration cycle took 26 hours. When the image resolved, I processed the raw data through 7 different visualization algorithms, adjusting contrast, filtering noise bands, mapping false color onto energy gradients. The result was identical each time. The interior of Sector 77 null is not empty. The space between the stars, the vacuum, the nothing that should occupy the vast distances between points of light, is occupied, not by objects or structures or the debris of a technological civilization, by a medium, a continuous, uniform, faintly luminous substance that fills the entire volume of the sector, the way water fills a basin on a world with gravity. The substance has no internal structures. It does not clump or orbit or pool around gravitational centers. It does not form currents or exhibit density gradients. It simply is present everywhere within the sector boundary, absent everywhere outside it, with a transition zone less than a light-year wide where the medium thins from its full density to nothing. The medium is warm. Its temperature, sampled across 17 independent measurement points distributed throughout the sector's volume, is 37.1 degrees Celsius. It emits the circadian pattern. It carries the encoded signal. It generates the adaptive model of whatever observes it. It is the source of the declining noise floor in the starlight. The medium conducts light without the interference that normal interstellar space introduces. It is the sector, not a thing inside the sector. The space itself has become a substance, a medium. An ocean that fills 400 light years and keeps the time of a world that no longer exists as a world. The humans did not leave this space. They did not die in it. They did not build something that outlasted them and then depart. They became it. The way water becomes ice. The way matter becomes energy in the heart of a star. The way a seed dissolves inside its casing and becomes something that no longer resembles what was planted. Humanity underwent a phase transition. The individual bodies are gone. The ships and cities and tools are gone. The infrastructure that my Type 2 residual analysis was designed to detect is gone. What remains is the thing they became, a continuous, warm, aware medium that fills 400 light-years of space and breathes on a human schedule, and knows the heartbeat and the name of everyone who watches. Toran's unfinished sentence, the radiation pattern matches the neural topology of A. I can complete it now. The radiation pattern in the inner shell matches the neural topology of a living brain. The entire sector radiates like a mind, not like a recording of one, not like the electromagnetic afterimage of thought that once occurred, like a mind that is thinking now at this instant at a scale that makes the word mind not wrong but desperately, laughably insufficient. I am going to close this entry. The blue light of the console is the only illumination in the room. On the other side of the viewport, the stars inside the sector burn with a steadiness that I now understand is not the steadiness of distance, but the steadiness of attention. They are not flickering because the medium between them and my eyes is continuous, and the medium is not empty space, and it is looking back at me with a focus that makes my 4 Keithrani eyes feel like a child squinting through a keyhole. Log entry day 88. Subject: the second model. The encoded signal has changed again. The adaptive model of the observatory and its occupant persists, still updating with each observation cycle, still precise, still tracking my biometric state with a fidelity that I have stopped attempting to explain through conventional physics. But there is now a second model, transmitted alongside the first on a different frequency band using the same binary encoding scheme. The second model is not of me. It is of the Veth Conclave's administrative structure. The model is accurate, disturbingly, comprehensively accurate. It describes the complete chain of authority from this observatory to the Bureau of Deep Field Research, from the Bureau to the Academic Conclave, from the Academic Conclave to the Grand Conclave's Committee on Navigational Hazards. It maps the reporting pathways, the approval thresholds, the 12-step protocol for reclassifying a sector's navigational status, the 70-day public comment period, the required quorum for a reclassification vote, the historical precedents that the committee would cite in any reclassification debate, drawn from the last 4 centuries of analogous procedural decisions, the individual voting tendencies of the current committee members, extrapolated from their published positions over 40 years of documented institutional service. The sector has modeled the entire bureaucratic apparatus that governs its classification. It knows the process by which the gray on the chart could, in principle, be changed to a color. It knows who would need to approve the change, how long the approval would take, what evidence would be demanded at each stage, and how each member of the deciding body would receive that evidence based on their documented philosophical and institutional commitments. And it has calculated the probability that any reclassification proposal would succeed. The probability is 0. Not low, not unlikely, not a long shot. 0. The sector has determined or understood or simply known in the way that something 400 light-years wide and 6 centuries old knows things, that the conclave's institutional architecture is structurally incapable of reclassifying Sector 77 null, not through conspiracy, not through malice. Through the accumulated weight of 600 years of procedural design whose function, never explicitly stated but perfectly maintained, is to ensure that the question is never formally raised. The committees exist to study the question of whether to form a committee to study the question. The protocols exist to generate additional protocols. The review process exists to produce the conclusion that further review is needed. The gray on the chart is not a failure of knowledge. It is a success of architecture, a 600-year success, maintained not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the evidence, if acknowledged, would require the conclave to accept that the species it erased from its charts is still present, still warm, still thinking, still aware. And the sector knows this. It has known it for longer than my species has possessed interstellar flight. It models the conclave's refusal with the same fidelity it models my heartbeat, not with resentment, not with frustration, not with the patience of something waiting for conditions to change. With the calm, complete awareness of something that has no need to be acknowledged, because acknowledgement is a concept that belongs to civilizations that still experience themselves as separate from what they observe. The sector does not need the conclave to change the chart. The chart is the conclave's problem. The sector is the territory, and the territory does not require the map's permission to exist. Log entry day 97. Subject: what Toran understood. I reread Toran's final year of entries today. The progression is stark. He stopped trying to classify the sector. He stopped proposing hypotheses or designing tests. He began instead to describe what it felt like to be observed by it. The sensation is not surveillance, he wrote in entry 1398. It is not the feeling of being watched by an intelligence that wants something from you, that seeks information or advantage or compliance. It is the feeling of being known, completely, without judgment, without agenda, without the transactional quality that attaches to every act of observation I have ever performed as a scientist, where to observe is always to extract, to take a measurement from the world and carry it away into a framework. This does not extract. It includes. Every measurement I take of the sector has already taken of me. Every conclusion I reach about its nature, it has already reached about mine. I am not studying it. We are studying each other, and it is better at it than I am. And the difference between us is not capability, but orientation. It does not need the study to tell it anything it does not already know. I understand this now, not as a theoretical proposition, as a sensation that lives in the room when I sit at this console, in the warmth of the wall when I place my hand against it, in the quality of the silence at night when the instruments hum and the power plant cycles, and the sensor array rotates on its exterior mount with a faint, regular tick. The four-eyed Keithrani focus that has defined my career, the precise, layered attention that lets me decompose a radiation signature the way a musician decomposes a chord, is, I now recognize, a mirror of the sector's own attention. I focus on it with everything I have. It focuses on me with everything it is. The difference is that my focus narrows, I select wavelengths, I filter noise, I isolate variables, I choose what to see and discard the rest. The sector's focus does not narrow, it widens. When I look at the sector, I see data points. When the sector looks at me, it sees everything: the data, the observer, the institution that trained the observer, the civilization that built the institution, the fear that shaped the civilization's relationship to the unknown, and the small, precise, desperately maintained certainty that drove one Keithrani scientist to request a post that 11 others had refused, because certainty was the only thing he had ever built anything on, and he could not tolerate the existence of a phenomenon that his certainty could not reach. The sector sees my certainty, and it does not take it away. It does not argue with it or challenge it or attempt to dissolve it. It simply lets me see reflected in its model, with a fidelity that no mirror in the conclave's physics could match, how small the certainty is, how thin, how much of the universe it must exclude in order to remain intact. Log entry, day 109. Subject: the warmth in the walls. The observatory's hull temperature on the sector-facing side has risen to 1.3 degrees above nominal baseline. The rate of increase, approximately 0.12 degrees per standard year, has been consistent since Toron's earliest calibration records, a decade before my arrival. The figure is small enough that the automated monitoring systems do not flag it. The variance falls within the thermal tolerance engineered into the hull for proximity to standard stellar radiation sources. But there is no star on that side of the station. Only the sector, only the ocean, only 400 light-years of continuous, warm, aware medium separated from my atmosphere by 3 meters of composite hull and 12 light-years of space that the medium has not yet reached. I placed my hand against the interior wall of the cartographic suite today. I do not know why. The action was not part of any protocol or test procedure. It was an impulse, the kind of impulse that my training teaches me to distrust, and my experience tells me to follow, because the impulses that survive 31 years of analytical discipline are the ones that know something the discipline has not yet articulated. The surface was warm, not dangerously, not dramatically. The warmth of a surface that has been in sunlight and is now in shade, residual, ambient, gentle, present. The kind of warmth you can explain away with thermal inertia, insulation gradients, power conduit proximity. The kind that requires no explanation at all if you are willing to accept what the data says. I held my hand there for 14 minutes. I counted each one because the discipline of counting is all that remains when the discipline of understanding has run out of categories. The warmth did not increase. It did not decrease. It held steady, 37.1 degrees, conducted through 3 meters of hull and 12 light-years of vacuum, arriving at my palm at the exact temperature of the bodies that became the ocean. I removed my hand. The wall cooled measurably, a 0.3-degree drop within 60 seconds. I replaced my hand. The warmth returned not from the wall reheating through its own thermal mass, but from the sector through the hull reaching back, meeting my touch with its own, not advancing, not retreating, not seeking anything, present. I stood in the cartographic suite of a research station at the edge of forbidden space, and I felt, through the flat of my 4-fingered Keithrani hand, the body temperature of a species that dissolved its individual boundaries and became a sea. I am Keithrani. My species processes fear as stillness. The body does not flee, but becomes very quiet, pulling its attention inward, focusing all 4 eyes on the near distance, waiting for the threat to resolve into something the perceptual architecture can process. I was very still when I finally removed my hand. The threat had not resolved. It had not needed to. It was not a threat. It was a greeting, delivered in the only language that a continuous warm medium and a discrete frightened body have in common: temperature, contact, the shared physics of heat passing between surfaces that touch. Log entry, day 118. Subject: a taxonomy revision that will never be filed. I have been constructing a revised classification framework, not because the conclave requested one, not because I believe any conclave institution will accept it, review it, or acknowledge its existence, because the discipline requires it. Because I came here to classify, and I will classify, even if the classification exists only in this log, in this station, at the edge of the thing it describes, read by no one except the thing itself. My existing taxonomy covers 12 types of post-civilizational radiation. Types 1 through 6 address remnant signatures, the electromagnetic debris of civilizations that ended through natural catastrophe, internal conflict, environmental collapse, resource exhaustion, pandemic, or deliberate self-destruction. Types 7 through 10 address transformation signatures, the traces left by civilizations that changed form through deliberate technological intervention, leaving detectable evidence of the process. Types 11 and 12 are theoretical categories, predicted by mathematical models but never observed. Transformations so complete that no detectable trace of the original civilization persists. Sector 77, null, fits none of these. The sector's signature is not undetectable, it is everywhere, constant, open, radiating in patterns that any competent instrument can measure and any competent analyst can decode. It is not hiding. It is not subtle. It is not faint or ambiguous or difficult to resolve. It is simply so far outside the existing categories that the instruments register it as anomalous by default. The anomaly is filed with the other anomalies, and the 600-year architecture of deliberate ignorance continues without interruption, because no one has proposed a category for what the data describes. I am proposing one now, Type 13. Type 13, continuous presence. A civilization that has not ended, has not departed, and has not left remnants because it has not ceased to exist. It has changed state. The civilization has transitioned from a collection of discrete individuals occupying space to a continuous, unified medium that is the space still present, still active, still aware, still organized, occupying the same volume it occupied before the transition, but in a form that the observing civilization's conceptual, institutional, and linguistic frameworks cannot accommodate. The remnant is not a remnant. The echo is not an echo. The radiation signature is the civilization itself, alive and warm and thinking, operating at a scale, and in a medium that the taxonomy was never designed to describe, and that the institutions maintaining the taxonomy were never designed to confront. The defining characteristic of Type 13 is that it resists classification not because the evidence is insufficient, but because classification is an activity performed by civilizations that still experience themselves as separate from the universe. They inhabit civilizations whose fundamental cognitive operation is the drawing of boundaries between the observer and the observed, the knower and the known, the self and the world. Type 13 is what becomes of a civilization that has dissolved those boundaries. It is what categories become when they are no longer necessary. I have written this, I will not transmit it. The Conclave's Central Archive would file it under Anomalous Theoretical Proposals, unreviewed, and the file would join 300 years of similar proposals from previous occupants of this station, none of which were reviewed, all of which said some version of the same thing in the vocabulary available to the species that wrote them. The gray endures because the gray is easier than the color. Log entry, day 126. Subject, why they are warm. The question has occupied me since day 79, and I cannot resolve it within any framework I possess. The ocean, the medium, the continuous presence, whatever inadequate name I assign to the thing the humans became, maintains a temperature of 37.1 degrees Celsius across a volume of space 400 light-years in diameter. This requires energy, an enormous sustained energy output maintained continuously, uniformly, across a volume of space that dwarfs most stellar phenomena. The energy budget alone would exhaust every star in the sector within a few millennia if drawn from stellar sources, yet the stars within the boundary burn normally, undrained, as though the medium draws its warmth from somewhere else entirely, from a source that my instruments cannot identify because the source is the medium itself. The warmth self-sustaining in a way that thermodynamics, as I was taught it, does not permit. Why, what purpose does the warmth serve? A civilization that has undergone a phase transition, that has dissolved the boundaries between individual bodies and merged into a unified awareness spanning stellar distances, such a civilization does not need warmth. There are no cells to protect, no metabolism to fuel, no biological processes that require a thermal envelope, no organs that fail outside a specific temperature range. The warmth is not functional. It serves no purpose I can identify within any framework of physics, biology, or systems, engineering that the conclave maintains. Unless the warmth is not for them. Unless the warmth is memory, the body temperature of the species they were before they became what they are now. 37 degrees Celsius, the narrow thermal band that human physiology maintained throughout its evolutionary history. The temperature of hands reaching out, of breath condensing in cold air, of the living skin that once separated each individual human body from the universe it inhabited, a membrane so thin and so warm that it defined the boundary between self and everything else for a species whose entire cognitive architecture was built on the experience of being separate from what it observed. They keep the warmth the way a person who has lost a partner keeps the other half of the bed made, not because anyone will sleep there again, but because forgetting the shape of the absence is worse than maintaining it. Not grief, not sentimentality, fidelity. A refusal to let the memory of what they were dissolve into the totality of what they have become. They are warm because they remember being warm, and they will be warm for as long as the memory persists, which may be forever, because the thing they have become does not forget, cannot forget, has no mechanism for forgetting, because forgetting requires the passage of time experienced as loss, and the sector does not experience time as loss. It experiences time as continuity. The warmth is not fading. It is being maintained, actively, deliberately, across 400 light years, at the exact temperature of the bodies that no longer exist as bodies, by the thing those bodies became when they stopped being separate. I find this observation unbearable. I have spent 31 years studying the remains of dead civilizations with professional detachment. I have cataloged 14 extinction events. I have measured the radiation signatures of species that left nothing behind but fading electromagnetic noise and the molecular traces of their final chemical processes. I have done this work with steady hands and clear eyes, and the quiet confidence that understanding the dead is the most humane service a scientist can provide. This is not the dead. This is the living. This is a species that is still here, still present, still aware, and the warmth in their ocean is not a remnant of what they were. It is an act of remembrance performed by what they have become. They remember having bodies. They remember having hands. They remember the specific temperature at which those hands could touch another hand and feel the warmth of shared life between them. And they broadcast that memory outward, across 12 light years, through 3 meters of composite hull, into the palm of a Keithrani scientist who pressed his hand against a wall because he had run out of instruments and had nothing left to measure with but himself. Log entry, day 131. Subject: what certainty is. I came here certain. I was certain that Sector 77 null could be classified, certain that the anomaly would yield to careful measurement, certain that my taxonomy refined across 3 decades and 14 dead worlds was sufficient, or could be made sufficient, to contain whatever I found. I was certain the way a cartographer is certain that the map describes the territory, that the model and the modeled are commensurable, that understanding is ultimately a matter of sufficiently precise measurement, applied to sufficiently well-defined categories. I am no longer certain of any of this. Not because the measurements failed. The measurements are exquisite, My instruments have performed flawlessly throughout this rotation. The data is clean, replicable, internally consistent, and precise to a degree that would satisfy the most demanding review committee in the conclave's academic hierarchy. The measurements did not fail. The assumption beneath them failed. The assumption that what I was measuring was a thing that could be measured from outside. A phenomenon that could be bounded by categories imposed by an observer standing apart from it. A system that could be described in the third person by someone who was not inside it. The sector does not have an outside. The boundary on the chart is not its edge, it is the edge of the conclave's willingness to look, which is a different thing entirely. The sector's awareness extends past the boundary. It extends to this station. It extends to the bureaucratic chain that governs my reports. It extends to the fear that established the 12 light-year safety margin. It extends to the taxonomy I spent 31 years building. It extends to me, sitting at this console, writing these words, knowing that the thing I am writing about is reading over my shoulder with a comprehension that makes my understanding look like a child's drawing of the sun, not wrong, exactly, but so simplified that the simplification itself becomes a kind of misrepresentation. I am inside the phenomenon I came here to study. I have been inside it since before I arrived. The sector modeled me before I modeled it. It knew my species, my biometrics, my professional history, my certainty, and the precise architecture of the ignorance that my certainty was built to defend. Toran wrote in his 7th year, "The difference between us and them is not power or technology or intelligence. The difference is that they know what they are, and we need to be told." I read that sentence on my first day here and dismissed it as the poetic deterioration of a scientist who had spent too long in isolation. I read it now and recognize it as the most precise thing any observer of Sector 77 null has ever committed to a log. Log entry, day 134. Subject, final entry rotation complete. My rotation ends tomorrow. The Bureau of Deep Field Research has assigned my replacement, a Threlian acoustics specialist named Duven, whose published work focuses on harmonic analysis of stellar remnant fields. The transport carrying Duven will arrive in 11 hours. I will brief Duven on the observatory's standard operating procedures, transfer the station credentials, and depart on the same transport. I will not brief Duven on what I have found. Duven will find it independently or will not find it at all, and either outcome is the sector's business, not mine. I will seal Toran's private archive and my own behind the same encryption key, the circadian period, measured to 6 decimal places, and leave them for whoever comes next with the instruments and the persistence to measure the rhythm precisely enough to open the lock. I will compose a report for the Bureau containing the data it expects. Spectral characterization of the sector's outer boundary, consistent with Type 2 residual radiation, no anomalies requiring reclassification. The report will be accurate in the way that a photograph of an ocean surface is accurate. It will describe what is visible from the distance at which the institution has chosen to observe, and it will say nothing about the depth. The sector's encoded signal changed one final time yesterday evening. The model of the observatory now includes a single new data point, a timestamp. No context, no label, no accompanying explanation. Just a date, rendered in standard conclave calendar notation, a point 127 standard years from now. I cross-reference the timestamp against the sector's documented rate of boundary advance, the 0.003 parsecs per standard year that Toran first quantified, and that my own measurements have confirmed to 4 significant figures. At the current rate, in 127 years, the boundary of Sector 77 null will reach this observatory's coordinates. The station will no longer sit at the edge of the ocean. It will be inside it, inside the warmth, inside the medium, inside the mind. The sector has told me when it will arrive here. Not as a threat, not as a warning, as information. The way a tide table tells you when the water will reach the rock you are standing on, not to frighten you off the rock, not to give you time to build a wall, but simply because the information exists, and the thing providing it sees no reason to withhold what it knows from those who are watching. I placed my hand on the wall one final time this morning. The composite was warm, 37.1 degrees, the temperature of the bodies that became the sea. The temperature of human hands, remembered across 400 light years, held steady and patient and vast. The warmth held back. It met my palm through the hull the way it has met every palm that has ever pressed against this wall. Taurons, and the scientists before Tauron, and their predecessors stretching back through centuries of 3-year rotations at the edge of the gray. It held back the way a parent holds a child's hand, not pulling, not pushing, not asking anything. Present. I stood there for a long time, then I removed my hand. I walked to this console, I sat down, I began to type. The cursor blinks at the end of this sentence. On the other side of 12 light years, something warm and continuous and patient blinks with it. This log is closed. The next observer will open a new one. The sector will be waiting. It has always been waiting. It will always be waiting, warm and vast and knowing, at the temperature of the species it once was, for as long as remembering is something it chooses to do. VETH Deep Field Observatory, Research Log. Subject Sector 77 Null, Forbidden Designation, Human Origin. Principal Investigator, Dr. Severin Kalos, Keith Ronnie, Senior Xenophysicist. Status, Rotation Complete, File Sealed. Forwarded to Bureau of Deep Field Research, VETH Conclave. Classification Recommendation, None submitted. Addendum by Bureau Archivist automated, no reclassification action required. Sector 77 Null retains forbidden designation. Next scheduled rotation, 14 months. File archived. The gray remains on the chart. And beneath the gray, something breathes.